The 1970s gave us some of the greatest sitcoms in television history. All in the Family, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Happy Days. But here's the thing about that golden age of TV. For every lovable character that made us laugh, there was always that one person who made us cringe every time they showed up on screen. Today, we're counting down 10 characters from 70 sitcoms that had viewers across America saying, "Oh, come on," every time they appeared. These weren't just annoying, they were the kind of characters that could ruin a perfectly good episode just by walking into the room. And trust me, after spending weeks researching this and rewatching hours of classic TV, I can tell you some of these performances were so grating, they're still hard to watch today. So grab your TV dinner and settle in, because we're about to revisit some characters that made the decade groovy for all the wrong reasons. Number 10. Howard Cunningham's boss, Mr. Schatz, Happy Days. Starting our countdown at number 10, we have a character so forgettable that most people don't even remember his name. But man, did he know how to kill the mood whenever he showed up. Mr. Schatz was Howard Cunningham's boss at the hardware store, and every time this guy appeared on screen, you knew the episode was about to take a detour into Snoozeville. While the Fonz was making leather jackets cool and Richie was being America's sweetheart, Mr. Schatz would lumber onto the scene with all the charisma of a wet mop. Here's what made him so insufferable. He represented everything that was boring about adult responsibility in a show that was supposed to be about the fun of growing up in the 50s. When kids tuned in to see the Fonz snap his fingers and make jukeboxes work, the last thing they wanted was some stuffy boss lecturing Howard about quarterly reports. The writers seemed to use Mr. Schatz as their go-to guy whenever they needed to create artificial conflict, but he was about as threatening as a paper tiger. He'd storm in, make some demands, Howard would look worried for about 30 seconds, and then everything would work out fine. It was predictable, it was boring, and it took precious screen time away from characters we actually cared about. What's worse is that the actor played him with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Every line was delivered like he was reading from a teleprompter, and his idea of showing authority was to speak slightly louder than everyone else. In a show full of memorable characters, Mr. Schatz was aggressively unmemorable. Number 9. Penny Marshall's Laverne, Laverne and Shirley. Now hold on before you start typing angry comments. I know Laverne and Shirley was hugely popular, and I know Penny Marshall went on to become a legendary director. But let's be honest about something. Laverne DeFazio was often the most grating character on her own show. Here's the thing about Laverne. She was supposed to be the tough, street-smart one of the duo, but more often than not, she just came across as mean-spirited and selfish. While Shirley was naive and optimistic, Laverne was cynical and crude, which would have been fine if it was balanced with some redeeming qualities. But too often, Laverne's idea of humor was putting down her best friend or being needlessly aggressive with everyone around her. The character had this habit of making everything about herself. Shirley would have a problem, and instead of being supportive, Laverne would somehow twist it into being about her own issues. She'd mock Shirley's dreams, dismiss her feelings, and then expect us to find it funny because she had a Brooklyn accent and wore an L on all her shirts. And speaking of that L, what was that about? We get it, your name starts with L. You don't need to monogram every piece of clothing you own. It was like the writers thought slapping a letter on her shirt was character development. Don't get me wrong, Penny Marshall was talented, and the show had its moments. But Laverne, as a character, often felt like she was written by someone who thought being loud and obnoxious was the same thing as being funny. In a decade that gave us genuinely strong female characters like Mary Richards and Maude Findlay, Laverne felt like a step backward. Number 8. Jack Tripper's landlord, Mr. Roper, Three's Company. Coming in at number 8, we have Stanley Roper, the landlord who made every Three's Company episode about 20% less funny just by existing. Now, I know what you're thinking, but he was supposed to be the antagonist. And you're right, but here's the problem. Mr. Roper wasn't a clever antagonist or even a particularly threatening one. He was just there, being gross and creepy and making inappropriate comments about his tenants. The character was basically a one-trick pony, and that trick was being a perverted old man who was obsessed with what his tenants were doing in their private lives. Every episode, he'd show up, make some lewd comment, get fooled by whatever scheme Jack was running, and then shuffle away. It was the same routine over and over again. What made it worse was that Norman Fell played him with this slimy, lecherous quality that was supposed to be funny, but just came across as uncomfortable. This was a guy who would peek through windows, eavesdrop on conversations, and make sexual innuendos about tenants who were young enough to be his children. In the 70s, this might have passed for comedy, but even then, a lot of viewers found it more creepy than funny. The show improved dramatically when the Ropers got their own spin-off and were replaced by the Brooks. Don Knotts brought actual comedic timing and likability to the landlord role, proving that the problem wasn't the concept, it was the execution. Mr. Roper represented the worst kind of 70s sitcom humor, lazy writing that relied on sexual innuendo instead of actual jokes, and a character who was more pathetic than funny. Number 7, Arnold Horshack, Welcome Back, Kotter. At number 7, we have Arnold Horshack, the sweat hog who made that annoying ooh, ooh sound that haunted television sets across America. Look, I get it, Welcome Back, Kotter was about a group of remedial students, and they were supposed to be somewhat annoying, but Horshack took it to a whole different level. While his classmates had distinct personalities and actual character development, Horshack was basically a collection of tics and catchphrases wrapped up in a bad haircut. The character's entire personality seemed to revolve around being desperate for attention and approval. Every time Mr. Kotter asked a question, Horshack would start with that grating, ooh, ooh, Mr. Kotter routine, waving his hand around like he was having some kind of seizure. And then, when he finally got called on, he'd either give a completely wrong answer or make some unfunny joke. What made Horshack particularly annoying was that he never seemed to learn or grow. Other characters on the show had moments of genuine insight or showed real progress, but Horshack remained stuck in this perpetual state of clueless enthusiasm. He was like that kid in your high school class who thought being loud was the same thing as being funny. Ron Palillo, the actor who played him, seemed to think that making the character more exaggerated would make him funnier, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of being endearingly goofy, Horshack came across as mentally unstable. His laugh was grating, his mannerisms were over the top, and his constant need for validation was exhausting to watch. The show worked best when it focused on the relationship between Kotter and his students as a group, but whenever they gave Horshack a spotlight episode, it was usually a disaster. Number 6, Corporal Klinger, MASH. Coming in at number 6, we have Corporal Maxwell Klinger, the guy who thought wearing dresses was the height of comedy for 11 straight years. Now, before anyone gets their combat boots in a twist, let me be clear. MASH was a brilliant show, and Jamie Farr was a talented actor. But let's be honest about something. The Klinger character wore out his welcome faster than a 2-week leave got canceled. Here's the thing about Klinger. His entire personality revolved around one joke. He wanted out of the Army so badly that he'd wear women's clothing to try to get a Section 8 discharge. And for the first season or two, it was actually pretty funny, but then the writers just kept doing it, episode after episode, year after year, the same gag over and over again. What made Klinger particularly grating was that the joke never evolved. You'd think after a few years, either the character would give up on this obviously failed strategy, or the writers would find new ways to explore his desperation to go home. But no, it was just Klinger in a new dress, making the same complaints with the same predictable results. The character became a one-trick pony in a show that was supposed to be about the complexity of war and human nature. While other characters were dealing with real trauma, moral dilemmas, and genuine character growth, Klinger was stuck in this weird comedy loop that felt increasingly out of place as the show got more serious. And don't even get me started on how the whole cross-dressing angle aged. What might have seemed edgy or subversive in 1972 just came across as tired and repetitive by the late 70s. It was like watching someone tell the same joke at every party for a decade. Even if it was funny the first time, it sure wasn't funny the 100th time. The show was at its absolute best when it focused on the relationships between Hawkeye, BJ, Charles, and the rest of the medical staff. But whenever they gave Klinger a spotlight episode, it usually meant we were in for 22 minutes of the same tired routine we'd seen dozens of times before. Number 5, Ralph Malph, Happy Days. Coming in at number 5, we have Ralph Malph, the guy who single-handedly proved that not everyone should be a comedian. Ralph was supposed to be the funny guy in Richie's group of friends, but here's the problem. His jokes weren't funny. At all. Every episode, he'd deliver these terrible one-liners and then follow them up with, "I've got a million of them," as if quantity could somehow make up for the complete lack of quality. The character was basically a walking, talking joke book from 1955, and not even a good one. His humor was so corny and outdated that even the other characters on the show would groan when he started talking. But instead of taking the hint, Ralph would just keep going, delivering pun after terrible pun with the confidence of someone who actually thought he was hilarious. What made Ralph particularly annoying was that he never seemed to read the room. Someone could be having a serious conversation about a real problem, and Ralph would jump in with some inappropriate joke that killed the mood. He was like that friend we all had who thought everything was an opportunity for a comedy routine. Don Most, who played Ralph, delivered every line with this smug little smile that suggested he thought he was the funniest person in the room. But the audience knew better. We could see the other actors trying not to roll their eyes, and we felt their pain. The show worked much better when Ralph was used sparingly, but unfortunately, the writers seemed to think that more Ralph meant more laughs. They were wrong. Number 4, Rerun, What's Happening? At number 4, we have Rerun, the character who proved that sometimes a nickname can be way too accurate. Rerun was supposed to be the lovable, chubby sidekick on What's Happening, but more often than not, he was just annoying. His entire personality seemed to revolve around eating, dancing badly, and getting into trouble that his friends had to bail him out of. He was like a one-man disaster area with a red beret. What made Rerun particularly grating was his complete lack of self-awareness. He'd cause problems, make situations worse, and then act surprised when people got mad at him. He was the kind of friend who would eat your lunch, break your stuff, and then expect you to feel sorry for him when he got in trouble. The characters' catchphrases and various food-related exclamations got old fast. It was like the writers thought that having him shout about food was character development. And don't get me started on his dancing. Every episode seemed to have at least one scene where Rerun would start doing these ridiculous dance moves that were supposed to be funny, but just looked embarrassing. Fred Berry, who played Rerun, seemed to be having fun with the role, but that almost made it worse. His enthusiasm for the characters' antics made them even more grating to watch. It was like watching someone tell the same joke over and over again, getting more excited each time, even though nobody was laughing. The show had potential when it focused on the friendship between Roger and Dwayne, but whenever Rerun took center stage, it usually meant the episode was going to be a mess. Number 3. Frank DeFazio, Laverne, and Shirley. Coming in at number 3, we have Frank DeFazio, Laverne's father, who managed to be even more annoying than his daughter, and that's saying something. Frank owned the pizza bowl where the girls hung out, and he had this habit of treating everyone like they were still children, even though his daughter and her friends were grown women trying to make it on their own. He was overprotective to the point of being suffocating, and his idea of helping usually made situations worse. What made Frank particularly insufferable was his old-world attitude combined with his complete inability to mind his own business. He'd insert himself into every situation, offer unwanted advice, and then get offended when people didn't appreciate his interference. He was like that relative who shows up uninvited to family gatherings and then wonders why nobody seems happy to see him. Phil Foster, who played Frank, delivered every line like he was performing in a community theater production of stereotypical Italian Father, the musical. His accent was so over the top that it bordered on offensive, and his constant yelling made every scene he was in feel like a stress test for your television speakers. The character represented everything that was wrong with 70s sitcom fathers. He was loud, he was overbearing, and he thought his old-fashioned values gave him the right to control everyone around him. In a decade that was supposed to be about liberation and independence, Frank DeFazio felt like a relic from the 1950s who had somehow time-traveled to Milwaukee. Number 2, Schneider, One Day at a Time. At number 2, we have Schneider, the building superintendent who proved that having a mustache and a tool belt doesn't automatically make you charming. Schneider was supposed to be the lovable handyman who looked out for Anne Romano and her daughters. But more often than not, he came across as a creepy guy who had way too much interest in his tenants' personal lives. He'd show up uninvited, make inappropriate comments, and then act like he was doing everyone a favor by being there. What made Schneider particularly annoying was his complete lack of boundaries. He'd walk into the Romano apartment without knocking, eavesdrop on private conversations, and insert himself into family situations where he clearly didn't belong. He was like that neighbor who thinks being friendly gives him the right to know everything about your business. Pat Harrington Jr., who played Schneider, seemed to think that being loud and obnoxious was the same thing as being funny. His character would make these grand entrances, deliver his lines like he was performing Shakespeare, and then expect everyone to be charmed by his presence. But instead of being endearing, Schneider just came across as someone who desperately needed to get a life of his own. The show worked much better when it focused on Anne's struggles as a single mother and her relationships with her daughters. But whenever Schneider took center stage, it usually meant the episode was going to be about his problems instead of the family's, which completely missed the point of what made the show special. Number 1, Joanie Cunningham, Happy Days. And taking the top spot at number 1, we have Joanie Cunningham, Richie's little sister, who managed to be annoying in a way that only a precocious TV kid could be. Now, I know this might be controversial. Erin Moran was just a kid, and she was doing what the writers told her to do. But let's be honest about something. Joanie was the kind of character that made you understand why some families sent their kids to boarding school. Joanie had this habit of inserting herself into every situation, whether she belonged there or not. She'd eavesdrop on conversations, blackmail her brother with information she'd overheard, and then act innocent when she got caught. She was like a pint-sized spy who thought being cute gave her a license to be manipulative. What made Joanie particularly grating was her precociousness. She always had to be the smartest person in the room, even when she was clearly out of her depth. She'd make these sarcastic comments that were supposed to show how mature she was, but instead just highlighted how annoying it is when kids try to act like adults. The writers seemed to think that giving Joanie more screen time would add heart to the show, but it usually had the opposite effect. Episodes that focused on her problems felt forced and artificial, like the writers were trying too hard to make us care about a character who was fundamentally unlikable. And then there was her relationship with Chachi. The whole Joanie loves Chachi storyline was painful to watch, not just because it was poorly written, but because it turned an already annoying character into a lovesick teenager who somehow became even more insufferable. Erin Moran did the best she could with the material, but Joanie represented everything that was wrong with 70s sitcom kids. She was too smart for her own good, too involved in adult situations, and way too confident that everyone found her adorable when the opposite was usually true. The show was at its best when it focused on Richie, the Fonz, and the gang at Arnold's. But whenever Joanie took center stage, it usually meant we were in for 22 minutes of watching a bratty kid learn a very special lesson that she'd probably forget by the next episode. So there you have it. 10 characters from 70s sitcoms that had viewers reaching for the channel dial, assuming they could find it under all the shag carpeting. What do you think? Did we miss any particularly annoying 70s sitcom characters? Or do you actually have a soft spot for some of these folks? Drop a comment below and let us know which character made you want to change the channel faster than you could say dynamite. Until next time, keep those TV memories alive. And remember, they don't make them like they used to, and sometimes that's a very good thing.